All right, so we are getting now into our actual assignments. This will be our first assignment. This is Unit 4. Unit 4 is where we really start to try to master compositing. We have already had 2 exercises. We just turned in exercise 2, where we're layering up things in Photoshop or Photopea, right? Compositing is just layering things up, but now we're going to be really focusing on making the pixels match, playing with opacity and edge control, playing with color, just adding on to our skill set with more subtlety. So this is a concept design project. We're going to have a couple concept design projects to understand compositing. This is where it's mostly used professionally in coming up with background settings that don't really exist. So if you work for a special effects company and you're told we need to make it look like there's a city underwater, right? There's nowhere they can photograph that gives them good examples of backgrounds in real photography for a city underwater. So they have to make that with computer graphics, more than likely, or with miniatures. But either way, whether it's digital or practical, they're going to have to conceive of it first. They have to come up with the idea. What's the visual pitch we want? So concept artists are hired to quickly mock up the feeling of settings and environments. And that's what we're going to take a crack at here. So it's a fantasy landscape on any theme you choose. And this is going to introduce our first question of the day as well. So as part of this assignment, we are just going to start thinking and then discussing next class, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using pixel-based digital art over traditional art, right? And that can be true in 2 dimensions or in 3 dimensions. But for one example, when we're talking about concept art, you can mock up different ideas and variations on those ideas of like an underwater city so much more quickly digitally. It might take just as long to build the original vision of it as it would take to paint it or draw it. But once you have it, you can do so many more variations of, oh, this is what it would look like with more seaweed. This is what it would look like if the light was warmer and filtered down. This is what it would look like if it's in the deep water shadows. And you can just make those perfect copies digitally and then do variations. So almost all concept artists are very well versed in doing everything digitally so they can create it quickly and then do a lot of variations quickly, because it's all about seeing the ideas. But there are also disadvantages to it, right? It can be easily stolen. It can be easily shown or copied by the wrong people, right? And sometimes it can have problems with it that it wouldn't have, like digital artifacts or noise or glitches that it wouldn't have if it was traditional. So here I have 2 fantasy landscapes. One is a composite, right? It's got some flaws to it for sure, but there is no real place where there is a house up in a tree with an escalator going up to it, or a face kind of, for whatever reason, randomly put into a tree trunk. And then here, this is a rice paper painting of a fantasy landscape, which is the dominant method of landscape painting in Asia, in Japan, in China, in Korea. And so this is all completely made up, but it's done with this material. You have kind of the mountains scrolling into the back, clouded with mist and fog, the tree in the foreground. But because it's all by hand and on this one material, using these same materials for everything, it has kind of an integrity to everything. Whereas all of these elements don't quite match each other in terms of their approach, their lighting, their sincerity. So that just gets you to think about this question. How do you get questions or credit for your questions of the day? You just follow the directions. I've added this link. I just added it this morning, because if you want to tie it to what we've learned in class, that is not the link I meant to add. This is the link I meant to add. Multi-plane digital backgrounds. All right. So I'll update that link. But this is what we're trying to do.
To make the backgrounds pop and appear 3D like the characters, the animators use several different techniques, such as multiplanes, where you have layers on top of layers to give the illusion of depth.
So this is another big advantage of digital landscapes. Is we can
To
play
make the backgrounds
with layers of depth. So we're going to have at least 3 layers of depth in our fantasy landscapes. A far background, a middle ground, which is usually where the most focus is, like these shards. We talked about scalability with our vectors. The middle ground is the part of any 3-layer of depth landscape concept art where you want to see the contrast and the edges most clearly. And then the foreground. Now, to understand this, as you're conceptualizing your space, to not make it flat, I'm going to turn on my camera here, and I'm going to have you guys do an exercise with me. So take one of your hands, put it up in front of your face, like that. Okay. Now focus on your hand, and notice, without changing focus, that the background around your hand is blurry. Everyone did that, right? That is 2 layers of depth. Your hand is foreground, the background is background, right? Blurry and sharp. Now you're going to take another hand. You're going to put it between your face and the hand you already have up. If you focus on the hand that's closest to you, if you can try not to go cross-eyed, you'll notice that it is sharp and everything else behind it is blurry. That's 2 layers of depth, right? But if you open up your fingers and you focus on the hand that's further away from you, you'll see that the hand in front, that's your foreground, that's blurry. You're looking through it. The middle ground, which is your further hand, is sharp and contrasted. And then the background behind everything is also blurry. So you have 3 distinct layers of depth. That's what we're going for. So when you see it all compiled here, you see foreground that's pretty dark, which is one way of kind of taking focus away. Middle ground that's nice and sharp and contrasted. And then far background, which is kind of, it's called atmospheric perspective, washed out. So we have blurry, sharp, blurry. And that gives us the most possible depth. All right. How are we going to do this? You just answer with over 100 words on the question topic. And this can be about landscapes, it can be about figures, it could be about whatever kind of art you like the best, but think what the traditional version is and what the digital version is. And then try to identify advantages and disadvantages of the digital discipline. And we'll discuss it in class and even make some notes. This leads us to our first assignment, right? So if we're designing our own landscape, we don't start by just gathering a bunch of random images, even if we're looking for foreground, middle ground, and background kind of images. And we're not trying to match exactly something we've already seen. Like if I wanted to do a fantasy ice cave, I'm not just going to try to match this with photos I find. Because that's not original. That's like trying to match something that already exists. We're trying to come up with our own concept. Concept means idea. But it can be inspired by things. So I want you to have a theme, just like we were inspired by our emoji maker for exercise 2. So before you can start finding images and then coming up with your own unique vision, you need inspiration. So in this one was inspired by kind of cartoon backgrounds of deserts. Foreground, middle ground, background, right? And then I started searching for certain rocks. This is an instructor, past example. And then did 2 sketches, one vertical format, one horizontal format, kind of playing with those different aspects I found from photos that were large enough, at least 1,000 pixels. Most of them from Pixabay, because you get the best quality that way, and Creative Commons Open. And I arrange them, and then I choose which one I like best, and then I use that arrangement as kind of the plan for putting all these puzzle pieces together. So in that way, I might be inspired by the cartoon landscape, but I'm not trying to recreate it. I'm trying to learn from it and use individual aspects like foregrounds, middle grounds, backgrounds that I find, but use them in my own way for my own purpose. And that way, whoever took these original photos wouldn't recognize them as their own, because I'm using them in my own way, I'm coloring them my own way, using them, flipping them sometimes, warping them, changing their lighting. So here we have a student example. The student wanted to do like glaciers, just mammoth, enormous, like Game of Thrones style, impossibly tall ice structures, and found these different kind of ice mountain references, and then kind of sketched them and layered them, and was trying to think in terms of foreground, middle ground, background, right? And arranging them in a way so that they overlap so it leads the eye back. And so that's the goal. By next class, I want you to have some references and have a sketch of your vision for it, like how you'll use those references. And I'm going to demo that. I passed this example out around printed. You can see that it followed their sketch really closely. Sometimes the sketch is really well thought out. They knew they wanted the Seattle Space Needle right in the middle. They knew they wanted this rough road sign, kind of ironically in the front. And then a lot of these were just from screen grabs of video games that already gave kind of this post-apocalyptic feel. But here's the trick, and it's the main reason I showed this one and passed it around. In order for it to be effective setting concept design, it can't have any live objects in it. So you can't have people in it, right? You can't have things like flames, because flames you expect to be moving. You can have like dust and soot, things that stay heavy in the air, but nothing that we would expect to actively be moving. Because later we have the option of animating creature designs on top of this background. And you don't want to have to add extra animation tasks, right, behind it. So this is a bombed out city and there's lots of vehicles, but the only vehicles we should be doing, if you're doing vehicles at all, should be vehicles that are not working, right, not moving, not expected to be moving. Same thing here. This looks like there's figures, but they're not figures. They're these giant marble sculptures, right, in this desert. Sculptures we don't expect to move. But if they were people, that would be a problem for setting design. You can see other examples here. You can see past tutorial videos on assignment 1, of course, on our YouTube. All right, so now let's get into the actual project. You are going to digitally composite at least 5 found landscape reference images into one large original fantasy landscape. At least 8 by 10 by 300, but we're going to do it a little bit bigger. In Photoshop, about 11 by 14 by 350 is what I'll demo. Once you determine your references, maybe not all of them, but some key ones that you really like, you will make at least one planning sketch before building it digitally in a raster imaging program, either Photopea or Photoshop, and we'll composite it together. I recommend doing at least 2, but you're only required to do 1 planning sketch. But by doing 2, one that's vertical, one that's horizontal, it makes you really understand the reference images you're using and how they can be arranged. So it really turns it into your original idea. Instead of taking one image you really like say this one, which was concept art done for NASA, so it's public domain, of what the view from this Goldilocks moon might look like. And saying, oh, I really like that. And then I use that as my whole image, and then I just drop in like 4 different types of trees, right? That's what I call a sticker sheet. That's not creating your own landscape, right? But if instead I say, oh, I want to use that foreground, like crater, and that's the only part of this I use, and then I find other reference for my desert mountains, other reference for my pink sky, other reference for my like celestial bodies in the atmosphere, then you're making it more original. So don't be over-reliant on any one image. So you basically want to work between 8 by 10 at 300 pixels per inch, and you can go up to 13 by 19 inches. But you need to be at least 8 by 10. And then you want to find your own inspiration. Not just for what kind of fantasy landscape, but also, do you want them to be heavy in the foreground? They're all going to have 3 layers of depth, but these are examples that are really heavy in the foreground. Heavy in the middle ground, or more focused in the far background.